What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, I want to go back in time a little bit to relive the unbelievable game Fabiano Caruana versus Magnus Carlsen from round number 1 of their infamous 2018 World Championship match. And here we go. In the game, Fabiano Caruana opens 1e4, best by test, and in this game, Magnus did mix things up. He's normally a 1e5 player, but in this World Championship match, he did go 1c5, the Sicilian Defense, and he had not played that in a high-level game with any regularity in a very, very long time. So let's see what he has in mind for this game. All right, Fabiano, knight to f3, and then Magnus, knight to c6, his old favorite move here in the Sicilian Defense, likely heading for a Sveshnikov Sicilian, and that is what he did later in the match. But in this game, Fabiano, he does not go d4. Instead, the move is bishop b5, the Rossolimo Sicilian, putting pressure on that knight on c6 in the spirit of the Ruy Lopez opening. And now White's going to have two main options. One is taking on c6 right away, damaging Black's pawn structure after b takes or d takes. And the other idea is to go short castles, then c3 and d4 again in the spirit of the Ruy Lopez. Now, in this game, Magnus did go g6. That was his preparation for this match, and he had a lot of very impressive ideas ready in this g6 variation of the Rossolimo. All right, in this position, Fabiano, he does take the knight on c6, opting for the exchange variation, if you want to call it that. So, bishop takes c6, and now normally most Black players in this position in 2018 were playing b takes c6, especially guys like Boris Gelfand. He was one of the biggest specialists in the Black side of this line at that time. But instead, in this game, Magnus did take with the d-pawn. D takes c6, capturing away from the center, and this leads to a very strategically complex position. Of course, Black's pawns are doubled on the c-file, but they do control a lot of very important squares. Black does have pressure on the d-file, and beyond that, Black does have the very important bishop pair. So overall, White is a little bit better here, but Black will certainly have his chances. All right, here, Fabiano, d3. Bolstering the pawn center and playing sort of a light squared strategy. He trades off his light squared bishop and now has all the pawns on the light squares, meaning he can go very easily bishop e3, queen d2, and so on, playing on the dark squares with the pieces and the light squares with those pawns. Now here, Magnus, bishop g7, of course, the standard move. Now we have h3, guarding g4, stopping bishop g4 ideas, and that is the strongest move here. Now Magnus, knight f6, knight c3, and here in this position, Magnus throws the first curveball of the game. I expected short castles when I was first watching this game, but instead he actually goes knight to d7, retreating the knight, a very typical Magnus move, retreating pieces but opening up new possibilities. Now, what is the idea behind this move? It's very, very complicated. We're going to see all of the nuances as this game progresses. Part of the idea is he wants to go e5, and both the knight and the bishop will support that pawn on the e5 square, and with that pawn on e5, he will have a much firmer stake in the center. But beyond that, there are many other ideas, as we're about to see. All right, here, Fabiano, bishop e3. That is the most natural move, putting pressure on that pawn on c5 and stopping ideas like knight to f8. For example, that would hang the pawn on c5 immediately, so you cannot do that. Now here, Magnus, of course, he does go e5. That is the main idea of knight d7 on the prior move. And now we do have a very interesting pawn structure in the center. Of course, those pawns touching on e5 and e4. And overall, it's sort of a Ruy Lopez exchange pawn structure. The big difference being Black's bishop is on g7, and that is not optimal in this structure. Typically, you want to go, you have the pawn on g7, maybe go f6, maybe bishop d6, and so on. All right, here, Fabiano, he has the option of going queen d2, but instead, short castles is the move, and it turns out castling on the king side in this line is a much stronger idea than going castling long on the queen side, so short castles does make a lot of sense here. Now, Magnus, in this position, he can just go, say, queen d7, short castles, and so on, but he has a completely different idea in mind. He starts with the move b6, supporting that pawn on c5, and that is very important as Magnus does want to go knight to f8 before castling, believe it or not. If the castles too soon, then knight f8 will be very hard to achieve, but without castling and with that pawn on c5 defended, knight to f8 is now a possibility. All right, here, Fabiano, he knows this. He knows he needs to act very, very fast. If he lets Black go knight f8 and then knight d6, then his dream of going f4, breaking on the king side in the spirit of the king's gambit opening is going to be ruined. So with that in mind, he does not go queen d2. That runs into, say, knight f8, then knight e6, and Black is sitting pretty. So with that in mind here, the move is knight to h2, a very important move, setting up that f4 break as soon as possible. Now here, Magnus, sure enough, he does go knight to f8, retreating the knight, intending knight to e6, and from there that knight will control the very important d4 and f4 squares. So with that in mind here, Fabiano, he must break on the king side first. If you go queen d2, again, knight e6 would control f4. That would stop the f4 idea or make it just way less attractive, as going f4 would cost you your dark squared bishop after, say, f4, e takes, bishop takes, then knight takes, and queen takes. That is not what white wants here. So with that in mind, f4 immediately is the move. Now here, Magnus, he takes on f4, e takes f4, then rook takes, and then surprisingly, instead of going knight to e6, he actually brings in the bishop to that square, bishop e6. And now, where is the knight going to go? With that knight still on f8, castling short on the king side is not an option, and black's pieces, they are like tripping over each other here. What is he doing? Well, it turns out Magnus, he knows exactly what he's doing, and he has a very deep idea in mind for this game. All right, here, Fabiano, rook to f2 is the move, retreating the rook, getting it out of the way of future g5, bishop h6 ideas, and so on. Very good prophylaxis. Now, Magnus, here, he does not go, say, knight d7, untangling his pieces. No, he goes h6, gaining space on the king side. And again, he's got an idea. I don't want to ruin it. All right, here, Fabiano, in the game, he did go queen d2. That is a very natural move, but a lot of grandmasters, especially guys like Adam Sandler, who was working with AlphaZero, the computer engine, to analyze this game, he pointed out the move a4 is quite a bit stronger, and the modern-day engine Stockfish does approve of that as well, putting pressure on the queen side, threatening a5 immediately, and black's king will be relatively unsafe on the queen side if it does castle there in the future. Now instead, queen d2 was the move, and here black does show his idea. g5 is the move for Carlsen, a fantastic move, gaining space on the king side, restricting white's pieces, especially the dark squared bishop, and now beyond that, setting up the idea of knight to g6, jumping in with the knight to g6. He would have his knight on g6 and his bishop on e6, a very weird placement for both these pieces, but hey, if it works, it works. All right, Fabiano, in this position, again, maybe he wants to go a4, gaining space. Maybe even a move like knight e2, believe it or not, could be good. Instead, rook a to f1 is the move in the game. Very logical. Fabiano playing very solid so far in this World Championship game. And overall, he still does have a very small advantage according to the engine. Despite Magnus Carlsen's really cool idea out of the opening, Fabiano is doing excellent still. All right, now, Magnus, he does not go knight g6 immediately. Instead, queen to d6 is the move, jumping in with the queen, centralizing it, and setting up long castles on the queen side. Now, here, Fabiano, he actually plays the move knight to g4, jumping up with the knight, and this is sort of the start of his problems in this game. Now, this move itself is not bad. He is threatening the move knight to f6, hitting the king with check. However, if the king moves, and it does in the game, long castles was the move for Magnus. Here, the knight going to f6 really isn't that big of a threat. I mean, what would the knight actually be attacking? It turns out it's not attacking anything at all. But Fabiano, he actually jumps in with the knight anyway. Now, this is not the strongest idea. Instead, again, a4, gaining space on the queen side, the AlphaZero a-pawn march. That is the right idea. Instead, knight to f6 played in the game, slightly dubious, and this is the real starting point of where things get a little bit tricky for Fabiano. And here, Magnus, he finds the right response immediately. Simply knight to d7, challenging that knight on f6. Now, where is the knight going to go? Well, this is Fabiano's idea. He goes knight to h5, putting pressure on that bishop on g7. Now, how does Carlsen 1 respond? Well, you can go, say, rook h7 or rook g8, defending a bishop, but that is not the best idea. Again, you want to keep that bishop alive. Now, if you want to keep it alive, there are two good squares, e5 and f8. Retreating the bishop, bishop f8 is not recommended. It's just too passive in general. So with that in mind here, Carlsen, he does go bishop to e5, keeping the bishop very active on this diagonal with the queen, pressuring h2 in some cases, and that is by far the best move in this position. Now, Fabiano, he's getting a little bit nervous about the king side. He does go g4, locking everything down, locking down that f5 square, and now there really aren't any pawn breaks on the king side for either side. I mean, f5 is never going to work, and these pawns on h6 and g5 are sufficiently blockaded. Therefore, here, Magnus, he goes f6, bolstering in his bishop on e5. That bishop is essentially stuck there forever. I mean, yes, Magnus could theoretically go queen e7 and bishop c7 and so on if he needs it, but for now, for the foreseeable future, that bishop is stuck there. All right, from here, Caruana, he goes b3, gaining space on the queen side, a solid move. Yes, it does weaken the dark squares on the queen side a little bit. That bishop does have some pressure on the knight, but as long as Fabiano is careful, that will not be an issue. All right, bishop f7, retreats the bishop and puts pressure on that knight on h5. Now we have knight to d1, jumping back with the knight. This is part of Fabiano's plan. Maybe he wants to go, say, c3 and d4. That could be risky, but it could work out. We'll have to wait and see. Now, knight to f8, retreating the knight. And now, very importantly, that pawn on f6 is hanging. You can't take it with, say, knight takes f6. And that is what Fabiano does in the game. Knight takes, then we have knight to e6. So, Magnus Carlsen giving up that pawn on the f-file. He's not concerned. And the engine does support the idea the game is still level despite Magnus being down a full pawn. And overall, the engine does show the game is relatively level, 0.00, despite the one pawn difference. The main compensation for Carlsen here, first of all, he has the bishop pair, and beyond that, his central control and his pieces in the center are just very well placed, very active, and that does give him enough compensation according to the engine. Now here, Caruana, knight to h5, retreating the knight, and black does take the knight. Bishop takes, then g takes, and then Carlsen jumps in with the knight. Knight to f4, an excellent placement for that knight. And now, if you want to get rid of it, you have to give up your dark squared bishop. That is a very important piece, as once that goes, all your pawns are on light squares, literally all of them, and that means your dark squares will be that much harder to defend. And sure enough here, Fabiano, he does take the knight. If you don't take it, let's say, I don't know, rook to h3, trying to defend h3, then the h5 pawn falls. So either way, you can't defend both of these pawns. So bishop takes is basically fourth, and it was played in the game. So bishop takes f4, then g takes, and then rook to g2. Caruana sliding over the rook, trying to gain control of the open g file. Not a bad idea at all. But Carlsen has the same idea. Rook hg8, challenging white's rook on g2. And now, of course, that rook on g2 is pinned to the king on g1. It's not able to go anywhere. So with that in mind here, those rooks are going to be traded sooner or later. Now, Caruana, queen to e2 is the move. And here Magnus does trade. Rook takes, then queen takes, and then queen to e6. Applying a little bit more pressure on the king side with the queen, keeping that queen on g2 honest, forcing it to defend the pawn on h3. Now we have knight to f2, reroute the knight, and rook to g8, this being the idea of queen to e6. Now the queen does support the rook on g8. The rook is technically pinning the queen to the king on g1, but of course, all is not lost. Caruana has the simple move, knight g4, blocking that pin. Now there is no good way to challenge that knight, and Caruana, again, is going to be relatively okay, although the engine does say black here is doing a little bit better, again, despite being down one pawn. All right, here, queen to e8 is the move, targeting the other pawn on the king side. Carlsen is definitely on the aggression here. He is attacking, and now Fabiano, he has no good way to defend it. The only piece that could defend it is the knight, but obviously knight f6 would be a blunder on, many different accounts. Losing the queen, losing the knight is just not a good move. So instead, queen to f3, giving up that pawn on h5, and now queen takes h5. Now we have king to f2, centralizing the king, an interesting choice. Bishop c7 for Magnus. And now in this position, Fabiano, he's got a very difficult decision to make. The engine here says you want to go e5, believe it or not, a pawn sacrifice, giving up the pawn, but that move is that is not a human move. That is not a move a human player would ever want to make. For some reason that works out. Part of the idea being the queen does have the attack on that pawn on c7, or c6, sorry. Things are very complicated. Instead, in the game, Fabiano, he does go king to e2, trying to get his king to safety. That is a more human-looking move, but it turns out to be quite a bit weaker. And here, Magnus, he finds the weakness of the move immediately. He just goes queen to g5. And what is the idea? You're freeing up the h-pawn, the soon-to-be alpha 0 h-pawn. It's not an alpha 0 pawn yet. It's only one when you go h5. So let's wait and see. In the game, Fabiano, knight to h2, respecting that threat, and Carlsen does go h5 anyway. h5, the alpha 0 h-pawn is born with h5 on the board, my favorite move as black on the chessboard. Now here, rook to f2, guarding along the second rank, the idea being queen g2 is not a good move now, whereas it was playable before, getting those queens off the board. Now, queen to g1 for Carlsen, then knight to f1, retreats the knight, and now here, the computer says simply queen g7, retreating the queen is the right way forward, but instead, Carlsen, he does go h4, pushing the alpha 0 h-pawn one step further, but this turns out to be a little bit inaccurate. And now again, the move e5 does come up, targeting that weak pawn on c6 of Carlsen. However, instead in the game, king d2 is the move, getting the king closer to the queen side. Now here, Carlsen is sick of this e5 threat with pressure on c6, therefore he does go king b7, defending c6 in advance, a very solid move. And now those pawns on the queen side, surprisingly, do a very good job of guarding the king on the queen side as a little mini fortress of those pawns. All right, now c3, threatening d4. Caruana trying to open up lines against the black king. Now we have bishop to e5, guarding against d4 ideas, and now king to c2, again pushing his king further over to the queen side. Now we have queen g7, retreating the queen and threatening bishop takes f3, a very serious threat. And here, Caruana, he ignores the threat. He just goes knight to h2. What is the idea? You are giving up that pawn on f3, but if black takes it, then the pawn on f4 does fall. So Caruana says, you know what? That is a fair trade. I'll let you win that one pawn if I win the other one in return. And that is what happens. So here, bishop takes c3. Carlsen falling for this trap. Instead, it turns out you don't want to take. Instead, the computer likes the idea of just queen g1, flying in with the queen once again. But instead, bishop takes c3 on the board. Now we have queen takes and bishop d4, pressuring the rook on f2. The rook must move, or should it? Well, instead in the game, Caruana queen to f7, hitting the king and the queen on g7. The idea being, if you take the queen, the rook takes back with check. The rook is defended. It's no longer being attacked on f2. Now, king to a6, a very tricky move by Carlsen. The idea being the rook on f2 is still under attack. Now we have queen takes, and rook to e2, defending the rook. And now we are officially in an endgame where both sides have even material. It is 4 pawns on the queen side for both players, and those 2 pawns over here on the king side. Now here, black jumps in with the rook to g3, pressuring that pawn on h3, the very weak pawn. He's going to win that pawn sooner or later. Now here, Caruana, knight g4, trying to activate his knight. Now rook takes h3. Magnus is officially up 1 pawn here. Now we have e5, Caruana. Despite being down a pawn, that passed pawn on e5 is a huge asset, and his plan here is simple. Push that pawn down the board literally as fast as he can. All right, rook to f3, then e6, then rook to f8, then e7. Again, Caruana pushing that pawn. Now rook to e8 is forced, and now Caruana knight h6, perhaps intending ideas like knight to f5, hitting the bishop and the pawn on h4. Now we have h3, the alpha 0 pawn marching down the board, knight f5 as promised, bishop f6, then a3, a defensive move on the queen side. Now b5 and b4, this being the idea of a3, trying to lock down the queen side in advance. Now we have c takes and a takes. And now Carlsen's pawns on the c file and the a file are backward pawns, meaning if he goes c5 or a5, white can capture, and that will make it harder for him to get that pawn majority rolling on the queen side. Now we have bishop takes e7, trading the bishop for the pawn. The idea being after knight takes, you go h2, threatening h1, and if you go, say, rook e1 defending, then h1 promotes to a queen, forcing rook takes, and then rook takes e7, meaning one way or another, both the knight and the pawn are going to come off the board. Now we have rook takes and rook takes e7, Caruana not messing around, playing it safe, and now rook to h6, pressuring that pawn on f6. And now here, of course, in this very complicated endgame, it is a rook and pawn endgame. Carlsen is the favorite here. He has 1 more pawn on the queen side. However, those being backward pawns on the a file and the c file means Caruana will have very good drawing chances. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit through the endgame to show all the moves a little faster. Now, king b6, then king c, and now Caruana, his main idea for defensive purposes is basically shuffling his rook around, just trying to stay active, trying to ask Magnus, what are you going to do? So Caruana avoiding the rook trade and continuing to shuffle his rook around, creating threats, flying all over the board. Now Magnus, sooner or later, if he wants to make progress, he will have to push his pawns on the queen side. Let's see if he has something in mind for doing that. Well, nothing so far, and funnily enough, Caruana is the first one to move a pawn d4, locking down on that square c5. Now c5 for black is simply not a possibility. If Carlsen wants to make progress here, sooner or later he will have to go a5, but again, that will weaken his pawns on the queen side. Now here, both sides continue. Caruana's main plan again, keeping his king stationary unless forced to move it, just shuffling his rook around. Carlsen knows that. He gives the king a check and starts to threaten different ideas like a5 with this rook move. Now king b2 hits the rook a4, king c3, a6. Carlsen going for a decent defensive setup on the queen side, but again, he's got to find some way to make progress here. Can he actually pull it off? Well, the rooks keep shuffling, the king defends the pawn, and both sides continue moving their rooks around, sharking around. Again, Carlsen, he's sharking around for some sort of mistake by Caruana, but so far in this game, Caruana playing absolutely flawlessly, avoiding any sort of mistake. Now here, again, the rook moves continue. We're going to go a little bit faster here, see if anything happens. And it turns out nothing much happens for the remainder of this game. Who hits the rook? Rook d3, giving up the defense of a6. Rook takes a6, then rook takes d4. Now Carlsen, of course, has those two pawns on the c file and the b file. But again, white is very active, and it will be very difficult to convert. Let's see if Carlsen, the greatest endgame player of all time, can pull it off. All right, king b3 defends, then rook e4, king c3, rook c4, king b3, king d4, rook b6. Caruana, again, doing an excellent job of defending so far. Of course, now rook c3 is one idea, but in the game, Carlsen does not go for that. Instead, king d3, moving forward with the king. Now rook to a6, rook c2, rook b6, rook c3 check, king b2, rook c4, king b3. And overall, Carlsen, he cannot find a way to make progress, and for that reason, in this position, both sides do agree to a draw on move 115. Wow, what a game this was to kick things off in the 2018 World Championship match. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much. Helps me out more than you know. And if you haven't seen it already, check out my coverage of game number 1 between Ding Liren and Gukesh from the 2024 World Championship match. Just click on your screen right here. It should be showing up right now. That game was an absolute shocker. Both players played incredible, but especially Ding Liren in that game. And it's safe to say the old Ding is back. So check out that video, and I'll see you tomorrow with more coverage of the 2024 World Championship match.